And so from the larger frame, it's really fascinating because I don't think I've ever seen a series or a story where the absurdity of what you're noticing is entertaining, because absurdity can be funny and entertaining, but it's also completely reasonable from the larger frame because we, the viewer, are meant to experience the severance ourselves, right? And so we're watching this and we're experiencing a kind of disconnection and confusion, right? But also wonder.
This is Jonathan Peugeot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
For quite a while now, several people that I know and trust and like have been encouraging me to watch the show Severance. And at first, when people presented the concept to me, which is basically the idea that like in a science fiction world, people are able to sever themselves between their work persona and the rest of their life. And the people in the work persona don't know and don't remember the rest of their life. And the people in the rest of the life don't know and don't have any memories or connection to their persona. And at first I thought, what a strange idea for a show. I don't know why that would be interesting. But after much insistence, I decided to watch it and realize that it is actually a really wonderful exploration of how identity functions, and how identities, hierarchies work, especially what happens when a hierarchy becomes dysfunctional and what happens when there is a break between the different levels of a hierarchy of a system, both in terms of a social system, but obviously the hierarchy that also exists within us. The first thing to say, which I was really surprised to see that this show came out, and it was filmed during COVID. It came out, in 2022, I guess? And it's just very odd to watch a show that was filmed during COVID be about a biotech technology that secretly controls your narrative and isolates you from, you're the full story and the meaning of life. And it's just very odd to realize that this was filmed during COVID. And I wonder if the people who are wearing masks and doing all of this distancing during COVID realized that they were participating in a form of severance while they were making it, not sure. And so the main character is Mark, and we're going to try to follow his story mostly because we could kind of follow different threads. But I think that, he, of course, because he's the main character, he is a microcosm of the whole question of severance. And it's very interesting to see that, the severance starts even before the severance in the brain, right? And so the reason why Mark is performing this severance in his life is because his wife died. He had a kind of trauma which broke away his marriage, or think of the marriage as the union of two people together in forming one body. And so he's severed from his wife dies, and then because of that, he can't keep his own life together. His work life is falling apart because he's drinking. And so finally he decides to sever himself in order to be able to continue. And so you can already see it almost like a process of fragmentation. And interestingly enough, in the second season, you find out that the severance had started even before that, because one of the things that led to all of this is that Mark and his wife Gemma, they were trying to have a child. And so they were really trying to express their unity in the formation of a family, which would be an even higher unity, right? Which would be this one in many, this dance of one in many that exists beyond the individual. But they're not able to do that. And it's in that moment that his wife dies and that he decides to sever. And so you can see this kind of fragmentation of the person already in the meta-narrative, right? Already in the narrative before the actual science fiction things takes hold, you could say. And so, before we continue, you have to always kind of remember how it is that I describe the world and, what it is that we're talking about when we say there's hierarchies, right? And so you kind of have to understand that all of beings function as hierarchies, and there are wholes and there are parts, and those parts also have wholes, and therefore you keep going down. You can go all the way down to, to the atoms or to quantum field or whatever. But even in a person, that's how it functions, right? So you can imagine that also that these hierarchies, they're cascading next to each other. There's not just one, there are many, and you can kind of follow the line down different hierarchies. And so you can think of yourself, let's say me, Jonathan, I'm the through line, just think of it that way. So there is a through line in my life and in my experience, the aspect of me that gathers the memories together and that creates a story that makes me one person and not many people. But then also inside me, you have sub-personalities, you have different aspects of your personalities, and in that you also have desires, and then there are thoughts, and all of these are multiple, and sometimes they can kind of compete with each other. They can be hostile to each other, right? So sometimes you'll have thoughts and you'll say, well, that's not me, right? You experience it as a temptation. So when you experience a thought as a temptation, there's a sense in which in the things that are happening inside you, as you go down the hierarchy, some of these things are maybe competing with each other. They don't know each other. And so you have to integrate them into the through line and say, no, I won't do that, even though I thought about it, because that's not really part of me. It's not at least the part of me that is the most integrated, right? So this process happens, in yourself in terms of your psyche, but it also happens in yourself in terms of, let's say, the same. You have you, the through line, the one who's acting, and then below that you have your members, your arms, your legs, those that follow your instructions, but you also have organs inside you, and then those organs have subsystems, and then you have cells, et cetera, right? And so that's just kind of how the body works, and you can experience severance, in your life. You experience it actually more than you think. You can think about sin as a form of severance, because sin is something like there's a little desire in you or a thought in you that forgets its connection to the whole, right? And forgets how what it's doing will affect the whole of the person, and is willing to kind of engage in certain behaviors that don't connect to the whole. And you do that obviously usually for a limited time. I don't know, imagine a sin in the series. You have adultery as a good example. It's funny because in the series, it's not presented as a sin, but it is for all intents and purposes, a sin in the series when Mark sleeps with Helly and the other Helly, and then all of that is kind of happening because of the effects that it has. So think of someone who commits adultery, right? That person all of a sudden has a desire, has a kind of substructure of thoughts and of desires and of intentions that sets itself up and cares more about it to realizing its own goals than the fullness of the person. And so cheating on your spouse, and then that causing all kinds of chaos in the vertical alignment, in the wholeness of the being. But people do that all the time. People betray themselves. They do all these things where they really are severed. They forget themselves. And think of the times, I don't know, that you lie to impress someone. It's like, what is happening in that moment? You kind of forget the fullness of you, and you're willing to lie and to pretend something and to twist reality to get some little thing, like to convince someone to do something, or to get some prestige or whatever it is that for the reason that you're lying, and that is already a form of severance. And you can think of it that happening in terms of mind and body as well, when you have kind of things popping up from below, hunger, sexual desire, all of these things, these systems that are acting. And then there's a disconnect between what you are, your through line, and your body, and that, how can you say that is also an image of the idea of severance. So before we go forward, I just want to make a little announcement. We are preparing at the Symbolic World a Symbolism Masterclass, which is really going to be the kind of culmination of all the videos that I've been doing, like the 500 videos that I put up on YouTube since I started this, I realized that people kind of drop in and out and they'll catch a video and sometimes they don't know where to start, like how all of this all comes together. So what we decided to do is put together what is it? How many are we doing? We're doing like an 18-hour, 6-class thing where we're going to have 2 hours per class plus a whole hour of Q&A, really engaging, so that we're going to go through all the concepts. It's going to be an introduction to symbolism, but not just an introduction. We're going to dive in and go into the deep concepts. And the purpose is that after this, you can really kind of have mastered symbolic thought, that you have everything you need and you can look at the world through the patterns, and you won't feel like it's disjuncted. And so I'm really looking forward to doing this because for me too, pulling all of this together, I think will be a really fun thing to do. So I hope to see you in that class. All right. And so in the context of severance, it's important to understand that the outie, right, is that integrated one. Why? Because the outie is the one that decides. The outie is the one that decides that the Innie exists, and the outie is the one that can decide that the Innie no longer exists, right? Because if they don't go back to work, if they decide to make, they can make that aspect of themselves cease to exist by quitting or not going back to work. And so there's a sense in which it's not just like they're severed and they're equal. No. They're severed really in a hierarchical fashion where you have the whole being and then you have an aspect of the being which is broken and cut off and then made to live independently from the integrated being. And so the Innie is like a prisoner of the decision of the outie, but we'll see that because they're severed, that won't always go the way it is. Think about how this is the case in yourself. You have certain internal systems, like you have desires, for example. So you're in theory the whole being. You have the power, you have the desire. But if you're not careful and you let these little aspects of yourself become independent and be severed from the full being, that is when things run into trouble. And you really see that happening in the series. And so you can think of it as a kind of alienation, right? Where aspects of yourself are alienated from the fullness of you, but you can also see it as a social phenomena, of course, because the experience of the Innie is, of course, to be alienated from any type of higher participation. So what's amazing about the series is that the severance happens at different levels simultaneously. So, of course, the severance is within the person, and the hierarchy is presented within the person, but the severance is also within the organization. And so the severed workers are also, just like in their own being, kind of these isolated little processes that function on their own and don't have any connection to the integrated thing. This is what's happening, of course, in Lumon itself, where the severed workers are analogous to what's happening in their own being. So the leaders of Lumon, of course, are not severed. The people that are running the show are not severed. They know what's going on. They have a sense of everything that's happening, but the workers are isolated from that purpose, right? And they don't know what they're doing completely. And so the image is very powerful. The company itself is represented as this kind of contradiction of this severing. You could think of it that way. The name itself, Lumon, seems to refer to light, right? The idea of luminary, right? It refers to light, but their logo is a drop of water or a drop of something. So you have this weird image, almost like in the name, which refers to something in heaven, but the logo, which refers to the image of earth or the image of water that is below. And then you see that happening in all the aspects of the company. Their slogan is united in severance, which is a kind of oxymoron. It's a contradiction. It's kind of funny because it reminds us of the pronunciation of a certain Canadian prime minister, the idea that we don't have any identity except for openness, that we only have diversity, right? Diversity is our identity. Diversity is our strength, which is oddly similar to this idea of united in severance, right? It's like that. It's a contradiction. But then absurdity itself becomes a tool of severance, right? Because we don't know what things mean, and the people that are there don't know what it is that they're doing in the company. And so the geography of Lumon itself has kind of two shapes. It's vertical, right? Just like the idea, you could say, of the higher identity kind of being fragmented down into the lower identities. But the architecture of Lumon itself, there's an elevator that goes up and down. So the full worker, the outie, comes at the top and then moves down into the basement where they are fragmented and where they are severed. They appear. And then we find out at the end of season 2 or in season 2 that there's an even deeper level that's below the level that they are, where, for example, the character Gemma, who is Mark's wife, who he thinks is dead, is not severed into 2, but is actually severed into 25 sub-personalities, And then there's like a horizontal aspect to the level. So there's like a vertical where you go down to be severed. But once you're in that level, then the level itself, is like a maze. And it's like a puzzle. It's forbidden to map the maze, right? It's forbidden to fully understand it. And you could say that in some ways, what they want is for you to not understand what it is that you're doing. And that's where the workers are doing all these tasks which seem completely absurd to themselves and to us, and they only know is mysterious and important. And so this idea that there is some kind of vertical integration, but we don't know what it is, right? It's something like a factory worker. Think of how factory workers were described at the beginning of the modern age as being alienated, alienated because of the separation between work and life, but also alienated because factory workers were just doing one little task and they didn't know what it is. They didn't have any participation in the fullness of the product they were doing. Sometimes factory workers don't even know what they're making. They're just making some plastic shape. They have no sense of the final product. And that is, of course, the image of this kind of absurdity of fragmented and isolated tasks. And so from the larger frame, it's really fascinating because I don't think I've ever seen a series or a story where the absurdity of what you're noticing is entertaining, because absurdity can be funny and entertaining, but it's also completely reasonable from the larger frame because we, the viewer, are meant to experience the severance ourselves, right? And so we're watching this and we're experiencing a kind of disconnection and confusion, right? But also wonder, right? Because the fragmentation or the lack of unity is also a kind of puzzle. That's what a puzzle is. A puzzle is a bunch of stuff that doesn't have vertical integration, right? That doesn't have identity. And so that's why there's also in the contemplation of the absurdity of the show, there's also a kind of wonder, right? Like you're trying to figure out, find the treasure. You're trying to figure out what is happening. And that's why the story in Severance is much better than that series Lost that came out, what is it, like around maybe 2002, I forget, 2003, because Lost tried to create a similar effect because the idea of being severed and being lost are very close in terms of the analogies, right? When you're lost means that you don't know where you are and you're severed from your final, like your home and your final destination, and being severed is something like that in terms of analogy. But what happened when you're watching Lost is that you realize that the writers were as lost as the people watching, and at some point, it really everything was just going around in circle. You were just like, there was no way out of the maze, you could say. There was no way to integrate. But in Severance, what's interesting is that the story itself offers the verticality all through the story, where there is a sense where you can perceive some of the vertical connection, whether it's in the characters themselves, and then it's more difficult to see it in Lumon, but we're kind of starting to see it. And so I think it makes the whole strategy of using this kind of absurdity way more effective. So the Innies, the social aspect of it, or let's say the corporate aspect of it, is that the Innies are representation of workers, or they're kind of like miners that are deep in a cave and they're looking for precious things that they won't benefit from, right? But at the same time, what's interesting is that they're also subject of an experiment, right? And they're being acted upon by the hierarchy that they don't totally know. And so they really are like a rat going through the maze, trying to get the cheese. But the rat going through the maze trying to get the cheese doesn't really know what the real purpose of the experiment is, because that purpose is outside of the maze, right? That purpose is the person who designed the maze, who is looking at it from the outside, and the purpose is not to get the cheese, right? So the rat runs the maze over and over, over and over, over and over. And although they get the cheese, they'll never know why that they're running the maze, And that's why the imagery of The Office is so compelling. That character Dylan, for example, it's interesting to see that he's motivated by these work perks. What is it? The watermelon party, there's Chinese finger traps and pens and doodads or whatever, little caricatures of himself. And these like petty privileges. But when we look at them from the outside, having the whole story, these look completely ridiculous and completely kind of arbitrary and not really very motivating, until you realize, that this is an image of our own non-integrated, let's say, goals and perks, the idea of getting a brand new car or a nice watch, or all these other signs of prestige that really serve as very proximate goals. And if you were able to scale yourself up a little and see these kind of motivations that we have from a more integrated, from the point of view of love or the point of view of the transcendentals, then you would realize that a lot of the stuff we chase after is pretty much the equivalent of what Dylan is chasing after in The Office. And so the severance aspect of the story is represented at all levels in their work. Of course, like I said, not knowing what they're doing, not knowing where different things are, but also they're isolated from the other groups and they're put in these hostile competitions with other teams in the company. And those other teams are also performing these absurd tasks that we also don't know what they are. But there's a sense in which it really is this idea that hierarchy in this sense is evil. It's more like an evil empire that is ruling over these broken, fragmented tribes. And, it's like the divide and conquer idea that if we keep these people away from each other, if we prevent them from joining together and becoming one, that's the way that we will rule over them. So you really have this conjunction of tyranny and fragmentation that I've talked about in so many videos, opposed from the real way it works, which is the unity and the love. That is how things are supposed to come together. So usually there's no competition between the levels of a hierarchy. The love for your wife doesn't compete with your love for your state. That should be ridiculous, and it's only when things are disordered that there appears to be competition between the different levels. And so, of course, the problem, though, is that if you try to isolate parts from themselves and isolate parts from the whole, the vertical integration, then that will ultimately backfire, because once the parts of something don't know why they're in the whole, then that's what's going to happen. They're going to compete with each other. They're going to compete with the whole. They're going to revolt, right? Think again of how sin functions. How, in fact, if you have actions in your life that don't know how they're connected to the full purpose of your being, now you have a problem, because now they'll take your resources, they'll compete with other desires, other thoughts, and you'll have this fragmented psyche in you. And it's the same that happens in an organization, right? If you have, I don't know, like a part of the police that are isolated from the whole system and have created their little internal state, a little bit like how when the CIA was dismantled, what is it, in the early 70s, this idea that it was said that they were a kind of internal state, like a state that has its own its own intentions that weren't aligned with the intentions of the country. There's a little bit of that happening with Doge right now, where there's a sense that there are these corrupt organizations and corrupt agencies that are taking the resources of the fullness, but because they're isolated, then they don't know how they connect, or they're not even trying to connect to the fullness of the story. Then they're like parasites, right? And so that's the problem when you separate things and you don't have them united, is you try to rule over them with a kind of tyranny, but that tyranny is always in danger of the problem. So this is what's happening with all the severed characters in the story. Because they've forgotten their outie, because they don't know their outie, right? They don't know their wholeness, their interests begin to compete with the interests of the whole. There begins to be competition between the two. And you see that happen in several of the characters, in the characters of Heli, whereas literally they seem to hate each other and be jealous of each other. And the Innie is basically hates her outie, and the outie is trying to infiltrate or to fully inhabit her Innie.
I am a person. You are not.
All of that is like a kind of dysfunction of hierarchy. You see that, of course, in the case of Dylan, who, his fragmented part is falling in love with his wife and is kind of competing with his wife. All of that, all of these different aspects of it, and ultimately you see that in the final scene of season 2. And this is what I want to kind of look a little bit more at Mark. Because Mark is the best example of all of this. And if you look at his story, you get a sense of how all this functions in the story. The origin of his severance is already a kind of severance. There really is a fractal thing happening in terms of his being severed. And so in his severed state, he doesn't know that the absurd things that he's doing, this idea of, macro data refinement, if you think about what that is, it's interesting because he's taking something whole, the macro, and he's making it more particular, which is, a little microcosm of the whole story. And doing that is actually what is splintering and torturing the person that he loves, right? It's increasing the severance, which is remember the original cause of the severance is the severance in Mark's couple. That's the origin of the severance. And so that he's increasing the severance by doing the work of sorting these numbers in all these different boxes. What he's doing is he's increasing the severance, and he is torturing his wife without knowing it, but he's torturing his wife and is fragmenting her, breaking her down into more and more absurd kind of iterations of human behavior. And this representation is pretty genius. We find out that the night that she died, that Gemma was taken into Lumon, and she was taken down to this lower level, right? This lower rung of hell you could think of. If you think of this descent down the elevator as levels of hell now, makes a lot of sense to think of it that way. She, different from the others, her Innie is also, her outie is also an Innie. That is, she doesn't actually have an outside of the world. She's trapped in Lumon, and both her Innie and her outie are now completely fragmented. And so she is really, literally in hell. If the others are more like someone who's sinning, who doesn't have access to their full story, and they're kind of broken and fragmented, really, Gemma is in hell for all intents and purposes. She's being tortured, and this descent into idiosyncrasy and these little aspects of human behavior that are completely separated from each other, they become a form of torture for her. So what happens is she's repeating the most mundane and idiosyncratic aspects of human life. We see a few of her Innies. She has 24, and then the 25th is being prepared. One of her Innie goes to the dentist all the time. Basically goes from one is constantly going in and out of the dental appointment. Can you imagine that's your life? You go to a dentist appointment, you leave, you come back right away, and you're constantly in the dent. It's like that's literally hell. And the other one is someone who's writing Christmas cards over and over and over and over nonstop. She has this huge pile of Christmas cards. That's all she does. That's all her existence is. And And so, so then you have this beautiful image, which is that Mark's outie, when he finds out that she is still alive, though trapped in hell, he decides to go down in hell to save her and to bring her back into fullness and to integrate her, not only integrate her to her own psyche, he also is trying to integrate his own psyche by integrating Innie Mark into outie Mark. But there's also a sense in which he will integrate with her, right? And they'll recreate that union that was lost and was the source of the severance in the first place. And so the final image of fragmentation, interestingly enough, the last Innie that's created by Mark's macro data refinement is this room where Gemma has to disassemble the baby's crib, right? So now we have this full circle, like I said, which is she's going back to the trauma that started the whole severance, right? Which is her incapacity to have children, and her incapacity for Mark and her to kind of join into that higher form of unity. And interestingly enough, it's also a reminder of how Mark started his own reintegration, if you remember, by hosting a conversation with himself, and the Innie talking to his outie through the video camera at the birthing cabin, where he's in this cabin that's made for people, for severed people to be able to give birth. So interesting there. And so, but like basically this disassembling of the baby's crib is the final hell. It's the final deconstruction, right? And we're told that this final deconstruction will end Gemma's life. And it's there that Mark, we could say for all intents and purposes, he's killed the Minotaur in the maze, and he arrives like the story of Orpheus, who goes down into Hades to save his wife Eurydice. But see, because Mark is severed, and because Mark's Innie doesn't remember the whole, right? Only truly knows his own fragmented experience, his own desires. So he chooses to stay in hell with his Innie, who, interestingly enough, to stay in hell with his own Innie's love, which is, strangely enough, is named Helena, like the woman that started the Trojan War, but also Heli. So interesting, right? She's Helena in the sense that she is the one that you save, but that leads to the war. She's the one that you fight for, but she's the most beautiful, but also has her name is Heli, like hell itself, as if she is this image of Mark's existence in hell. And already you can see that in his experience with her, there's like an extra level of severance, already in his experience, because one time he sleeps with her and it's actually the Helena from the outie Helena that's infiltrating the inside. And then the other time he sleeps with her, it's Helena's Innie. But the thing is, right, is that because now there's a doubt, you never know. I mean, the whole time at the end, I kept asking myself, which Heli is it? I don't even know. I mean, she says that she's not the one from the outside. But to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reveals in the next season is that when he saves her at the end and he runs off with her, that it's actually, the Heli from the outside. Maybe, I don't know. It's not clear, but probably not, because there's this weird scene with her father where her father says he sees the spirit of Kira in her. So probably in her case, you'll see a kind of inversion where her Innie will become the outie and the outie will become the Innie. Basically that she'll be the only one, I think, just prediction for the next seasons, she'll be the only one that'll be freed from, not integrated, but freed from the inside. We'll see. That's my prediction. So Mark decides to stay with Heli in hell, and she lets him, by the way. So they both know that this is impossible when they do that. They both know that their time is up and that, there's no way now that they can stay there together. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely absurd. And then he leaves Mark's outie wife, who after all this time has found her husband. He leaves her screaming outside and alone. But you also totally understand the motivations of all the characters, because Mark's Innie isn't Mark's outie, and he is completely severed, and he doesn't see why he should act for the person that put him in hell. Like, why would you act to defend and to help the person that imprisoned you in this situation, right? An interesting thing related to all of this is that, and just to show how really strong the writing is, there's one scene that could be said to contain all of Mark's story in a single moment, and that's what makes it fascinating. There's a scene where Mark, before the severance, right, on the night that his wife died, he's sitting at his desk, he's working, and he's clearly already discouraged and kind of alienated by the fact that they can't have a child together. They can't have a family, right? That true image of one and many that I mentioned. And so he can't hear Gemma when Gemma tells him that she loves him. He's too busy working. And then when she repeats it, he answers kind of dismissively, "Oh, I love you too," but what he really means is, "All right, it's time for you to go now," basically kind of waiting for her to leave. And then what's interesting is that in that moment, right, there's the entire story in seed form. The whole madness of severance and of this breakdown into absurdity is hidden there as a seed in that little scene. And it's funny because Gemma is like going to play charades. She's already kind of going into the puzzle. She's kind of going into the maze. And there he's already lost her, and he's already lost himself. So yeah, really well done. Another aspect worth mentioning is that because the hierarchy is presented as mostly negative, there's also a sense by which the vertical selves, right, the outie, is kind of like baggage. You could say that the outie also represents a story that weighs too heavily upon them. And you can think about it like that's what motivated the creation of the Innie in the first place. You could think of it as like an accumulation of sin. You see that, of course, in the case of Bert, where they'd say that the reason why they created the Innie Bert was because the outer Bert had done these horrible things, and when he dies, he won't go to heaven. So let's create like a new little Bert, a little Innie Bert that might have a chance, that he might have a chance to go to heaven. So this weird idea that in some ways the severance is a way of reinventing yourself, of rediscovering some kind of innocence. And you can kind of think that, like we all have examples of that in our life. Think about like if you move to a new city, or if you find new friends, or you start a new job or a new relationship, and that is always an opportunity to, you could say, cut off the old and start a new story. And that's imaged in the Bible, of course, as crossing the sea, going through the flood after a corrupt tyranny like the Pharaoh has been abandoned, and moving into a new world. It's an image of baptism, you could say. And so that's an interesting aspect. But in the darker aspect of this same structure, there is a basic anti-hierarchy thing which permeates the entire story. It's not surprising. It is a modern story after all. And the Innies are portrayed as slaves who are called, and you kind of expect them, and you know that one day they will ultimately revolt against either their outie or against Lumon, and in this angle, we see that there's a kind of atheist vision or reductionist vision at hand, where revolution is really the ideal. And that's why it seems to me that's why the religious aspect of the story, or this kind of veneration of Kir and this kind of religion of Kir, is how Kir is like portrayed in art and literature, all through the buildings, through these kind of these kind of museums and places where they go to venerate. Kir is really a kind of cynical control, what Marx called the opium of the masses. And in that sense, ritualization is presented all through the series, and it's kind of presented as a kind of false solemnity, a kind of mechanical procedure, obsession with detail, kind of OCD type behavior. And we even discover, strangely enough, that there's a kind of cultish goat sacrifice aspect to the story. We see that when Gemma is about to be annihilated by the crib. And so this whole religious aspect is dark and kind of perverted and is not obviously not a positive imagery of what religion can be or what religion is. Ultimately, the entire structure of the story is kind of like agnostic structure in that sense, you know, where this idea that the leader, the archons of the world are twisted. You know, our reality is a kind of hell. It's a prison. You know, it's a little bit of the idea of reincarnation, this idea of you know, moving down into Maya, you know, going down into the cave where everything is kind of a flashy illusion, and that it's not enlightened. And so at the same time, like the way that is written is so surprising that sometimes I had the insight that it's kind of like a more successful version of The Matrix, or a better written one, where you have this idea where that the workers, the innies, the one that are in the Matrix, really in this case are the batteries in a deeper way than in the Matrix. You know, they're like the batteries. They provide the money. They provide the energy for those higher selves to continue to exist, but they're not integrated to the purposes and those identities. And so because of that, they want to be free, they want to compete, they want to revolt, and they want to escape the tyranny that comes from a lack of love and the lack of integration across the different levels of being. And so these are my thoughts on Severance. I have to say I really enjoyed it. I don't watch a lot of things these days. It just takes up too much time. But I'm really happy that I did, and I hope that my insight was useful to you, and it helped you realize how this hierarchy of being functions, and especially how it functions when it is not functioning, when it is broken. So thanks everybody for your attention, and I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.